Firstly, sorry if the title seems a bit vague, but this is mainly about aspects of Mass Effect I feel aren't discussed enough. When the Mass Effect trilogy is discussed, the highlights of talking points are often about the choices made, the characters, or the story itself. However, the details that blend into the background are just as important to holding up the world building of these games. Also, as a warning, this might be a bit of an incoherent ramble, since explaining my subjective opinions on matters isn't always my strongest skill, especially if it's a niche topic such as this. As the most open world focused of the games, much of Mass Effect 1's atmosphere is built on the explorable side planets. Admittedly, this isn't one of the most enjoyed parts of the game, and I can see why, with it being the part I least commonly focus on during replays. But to some extent, the repetitive aspects do fit with this. By the time of the games, life has been widespread enough in the galaxy for long enough that the need for exploration has for the most part slowed, but at the same time these planets still uphold one of the main constants of the universe, that space is big. However, by the time that humanity got there, most of the known galaxy, specifically the desirable planets, had already been taken, which in part likely led to, instead of focusing on building up their pre-existing worlds and making them mirror Earth itself, humanity just dumped resources onto any suitable planet they could access, regardless of how thinly spread it's left them, nor how ill-equipped it's left the system's alliance to respond to external threats, as referenced in multiple events set before the first game, and that the player sees happen in the games themselves, whether it be in the main plot, side content, or DLC. Returning to these planets, they are most often set in environments of seemingly unending mountains and harsh weather. While searching for whatever brings the player to them, climbing and navigating said mountains, driving through the inhospitable environments, and avoiding any suspiciously large piece of flat terrain that may be hiding a Thresher Maw, there's often little to captivate the player's interest, as it's mainly just Shepard, the Mako, and the player's sheer determination that the vehicle can in fact defy the game's physics engine and climb any mountain that isn't a 90-degree angle. However, every now and again on each planet, the player will find an artifact or ship ruin that demonstrates that Shepard is not the first to venture across the surfaces of these worlds, which combines with some of the derelict ship encounters to reinforce the point that most of the great sci-fi universes do at least once. That space exploration is not a task to be taken lightly, which also ties back in with the early sequences of Mass Effect 2. Even Star Wars has examples of this, although mainly in more obscure sources and often based around setting-specific factors. These senses of the dangers of space exploration and of the inescapable size of the universe, although to a lesser extent, is present even in the main story, as not only is the player required to use the Mako at least once per planet, but Therum is basically a linear equivalent to the side quest planets. No various conditions match the biomes of multiple uninhabited planets, but had seemingly been assigned purpose arbitrarily from an in-universe perspective, and the game outright states that Vermeer would otherwise be a paradise planet if it weren't in constant danger given where in the galaxy it resides. And these are environments that, for the most part, have comparisons in the real world, unlike some of the planets that look like the Normandy accidentally dropped Shepard and the Mako into hell. For fans of this form of presentation, the next game in the series may be bringing back this sort of atmospheric tone, as both trailers we have seen so far have involved hostile environments, with the first putting an emphasis on it, while in the background of the other, the outside seems to be a harsh environment. Alongside this, Mass Effect 1 has multiple ways of foreshadowing the main twist to first-time players if they stop and think about scenarios they encounter, such as the vague references to galactic civilizations before the Protheans, something that carries over to some extent in the later games, and the intentionally noted inconsistencies between different forms of Prothean technology, or between husks and wider Geth capabilities. Although for the most part these are things that the player needs to actively seek out or pay attention to while engaging in exploration aspects of Mass Effect's side content. One of the most memorable moments from the game is how it transitions to the wider setting. Aside from the red sky, which is much more prominent in the original version of the game, and the ambient wildlife, the environment of Eden Prime is a largely familiar Earth-type setting, Yet, once the story leaves the planet, it goes straight to the Citadel, both metaphorically and later literally opening the galaxy up to the player, transitioning to an immense space station comparable in scale only to the mass relays themselves, and with extremely scenic views upon returning to gameplay, both with the curving halo-type structure of the Presidium and later the expansive city-like wards. On top of this, the backgrounds of both of the main Citadel areas are used to convey a much larger sense of scale than their layouts alone can present, with the artificial sky of the Presidium obscuring the entire ring, and the end of the wards having an expansive view that puts the entire scale of the Citadel on display from an on-foot perspective. Similarly, most of the significant and homeworld type locations seen throughout the trilogy are used with intention. In Mass Effect 1, despite it presumably being the planet in the very first cutscene, the player is unable to visit Earth at all, with the only time they can even get close to it being a single side quest on the Moon. And even here, the Moon is presented in its traditional, uninhabited and uninhabitable state. Then with the emphasis on squad loyalty in the second game, Tuchanka and the Quarian migrant fleet are natural additions to the story, both for the characters in that game, visiting Rex from Mass Effect 1 on Tuchanka specifically, and setting up story beats for the final entry in the trilogy. With Mass Effect 3, each of the significant homeworlds that we can visit are used for the main storyline, and also are used for significant turning points. Thessia in particular is used to usher in the final act of the base game, with the biggest defeat in the entire trilogy. Well, unless the player chooses the refusal ending. Moving to the second game, Mass Effect 2 has a strong opening cutscene from an atmospheric and framing perspective, with the lighting and framing of the sequence keeping the elusive man obscured until the end, as an immediate indicator to the player to be suspicious of him from the beginning, along with making him live up to his title. Unfortunately, this stylistic choice isn't maintained consistently throughout the rest of the character's cutscenes, although it does reappear a few times. On the one hand, having such highly stylized framing for a regular conversation could have been off-putting, but on the other, I feel that a better balance could have been found between the way the initial cutscene handled it and how the rest of the game did. Befitting the more squadmate-focused story of Mass Effect 2, it is the only game where the Citadel is not involved in any large-scale battles for controlling the galaxy. However, and I may be the only one who has ever felt this way, but seeing it in a calm before the storm type state feels somewhat ominous with the context of Mass Effect 1 and the hindsight knowledge of Mass Effect 3. Especially as it sets the player in the middle of the setting, unlike the first game where the areas overlooking the skybox made it feel like the player was looking down on the rest of the Citadel as a set piece rather than a setting. Although I do like the reuse of the main wards area from the first game and the cutscene that plays whenever the Normandy arrives at the Citadel. Although to different degrees, this feeling also extends to each of the hub world locations, with the Citadel and Ilium presenting surface-level views of the heights of galactic prosperity and civilization, while Tuchanka and Omega Station have a sense of grim and stubborn acceptance of the unchanging state of the galaxy, which goes to show just how significant events need to be to shift these factors, as further demonstrated by the fact that each major status quo of the galaxy that gets overturned being caused by both Shepard and the Reapers, or even such status quos being kept in place by Shepard's decisions throughout the trilogy. Regarding Ilium specifically, it acts as a good contrast to the early stages of the game, especially the previous story quest on Horizon, if the player chooses to visit Ilium as their next location. Interestingly enough, both the Citadel and Ilium are locations that are completely optional, although still highly recommended, in the story of the game, at least as far as progressing the main questline is concerned. Along with this, each of the urban-type locations and maps in this game remind me of a specific aspect of Coruscant. The most obvious of these is Ilium, being reminiscent of the top-of-the-world type skyscrapers prominently shown during the planet's live-action appearances, along with the chase sequence from Lair of the Shadow Broker basically being the Attack of the Clones chase scene, but with skycars. Then the Citadel wards, minus the skybox of the wider station and space, is the way that I would picture regular life looking on levels just out of reach of consistent sunlight, although this is most prominent with the presentation of the area included in Mass Effect 3's Citadel DLC. Finally, even though the most direct comparison for Omega Station in Star Wars would be Nar Shaddaa, along with the external resemblance to High Charity from Halo. It does remind me of references in Star Wars Legends lore of hundreds of levels worth of Coruscant being left to the chaos of gang warfare purely due to the sheer scale of the planet. Adding to this, the generator sequence and general infrastructure areas in the Omega DLC in the following game also seem like they wouldn't be out of place on a city planet like Coruscant. As an expansion on the elevator sequences in the first game, the hub worlds each have in-universe news broadcasts that give wide context to the state of the universe. For example, if the player chose the Paragon ending in the previous game, there will be references to humanity becoming more cooperative with other species as part of their duties on the Citadel Council, to show that, although the other members of the Citadel Council itself view humanity as lesser, the species they represent are more pragmatic about the situation, both in terms of humanity standing in the galaxy and the looming collector threat. Meanwhile, if the player chose the Renegade ending, there's a generally passive-aggressive tone across the Citadel. With the emphasis on unifying the galaxy, Mass Effect 3 gives the players the greatest display of each of the major species' homeworlds and building styles, returning to the early point about the intentional use of such locations. Starting at Earth, the game gives the player about 5 minutes before the Reapers attack, with a strong sense of ominous tone throughout, knowing that it is the inevitable way for the game to start even before Shepard confirms it. Although the characters still will get their first sight of the Reapers at somewhat of a disconnect, with these displays using footage from one of Mass Effect 3's live-action trailers, which is something I don't think I've seen people point out before. Then, once gameplay begins, and as the player sees throughout the game, the Reapers are present en masse throughout the map to properly convey their scale to the player. Previously, there were ways of keeping the Reapers at a disconnect. On Eden Prime, Sovereign was at far enough of a distance that it would only be a problem for Shepard and the others if it chose to make itself one, while the Citadel in Mass Effect 1 and the brown dwarf that the derelict Reaper orbited in Mass Effect 2 were both comparatively large enough to obscure their perspective. But when shown on the ground in Mass Effect 3, they tower over any individual and make it seem as if they could take out an entire field of enemies just by walking, especially with the Reaper Thessia that towers over the player. Or, to put it another way, I think Zaid is the best description of what it would be like fighting a faction like the Reapers.
Just doesn't feel like a real ground war when your opponents are taller than goddamn skyscrapers.
As far as I've been able to find, at least in the story, the only Taurian buildings and structures the player sees are the outpost buildings from the related priority quest. Fitting for the militaristic way the Taurians had been characterised throughout the games, along with re-establishing the Reaper threat by showing how rapidly the Reapers are able to gain the advantage in the battle against the Taurians, both in space and on the ground, with the first cutscene of the level showing that the Reapers had already forced the Taurians onto the back foot and forcing them into a counter-attack to retake their own homeworld of Palaven. Not only placing the planet itself in the skybox to keep it at a distance rather than having the level take place on it, but also have the level structured so that the player is consistently proceeding towards it, as a constant reminder of what the Reapers are capable of. Meanwhile, Solarian designs are open-spaced like the Presidium areas of the Citadel and built into the hillsides, with the initial area of Surkesh being the one space, aside from the Citadel itself, where the surroundings seem calm, something that the squad mates can even comment on if you find the correct prompt. Something that I myself have missed on until my most recent playthrough. Unlike Ilium in the previous game, the Asari locations have a much more unique visual identity, with the grand sweeping skyscrapers making it seem like that the style of their ships, especially the Destiny Ascension, were influenced by such constructs, and if necessary, could hide in plain sight by landing alongside them. Only for all this elegance and beauty to be torn asunder by the Reapers. This game is also the one that has the greatest sense of impact of the main story on the hub-type environments, since the scenarios in each of the available levels of the Citadel irreversibly change, and some pieces of side content become locked off to the player as they advance through the main storyline. For the Citadel itself, most of the maps become more crowded as the game goes on, especially with how the refugee area gets filled with a wider range of species acting as a representation of the Reapers claiming more and more territory, with the Citadel becoming the most natural point for those escaping the Reapers to flee to. But not the only one. Throughout the maps, there are NPCs occasionally referencing Sanctuary, and the DLC maps have in-universe advertisements for the location to keep it passively present for the player when it becomes an important part of the story. The Leviathan DLC places a focus on bringing back the passively unsettling atmosphere of its predecessors. The most obvious example of this is the final quest, where Shepard and the other characters are stranded on a shipwreck with nothing but never-ending ocean surrounding them, only for Shepard to then become further isolated when dropping into the ocean to continue the search. Alongside this, the other planets included in the DLC generate similar feelings already discussed to varying extents from the first game, with the first planet having an effective unsettling sense about it between combat encounters, and the surrounding area at the bottom of the mountains that the second planet is overlooking look like it would fit right in with the environment from the first game's open worlds. To round out the Mass Effect 3 segment, I simultaneously like and dislike the human armour designs. It's good that we actually get a consistent armour design for the Systems Alliance, as the use of random armours for Systems Alliance NPCs in the other games just subtly annoys me, and the main design we get in this game stands on its own, while also taking clear inspiration from some of the human heavy armours from the first game. Meanwhile, with the Cerberus designs, they look cool for a villain faction, mostly, but I'm surprised they didn't use any of the armour designs that the player has access to in Mass Effect 2 or 3. Not counting the armour available in Citadel DLC, since that was added after the game's release. Now for what I feel is the most underrated and unexplored part of the series, its spaceships. Aside from the Reapers and the different iterations of the Normandy, I feel this is a barely discussed aspect. However, I'm going to have to start with a complaint. I think the Quarians needed more ship types in Mass Effect 2 and 3. It's not a case of simply disliking the designs, but it doesn't fit well with the story behind the Quarian migrant fleet to have that level of uniformity. All it would have needed would be to throw in some Taurian or Asari ships, or even just some of those basic ship designs used for all the drift or abandoned spaceship side quests in the first and second games, to go alongside them to give it more of a thrown together look based on how the Quarians are constantly on the move through space and having to scavenge whatever ships they can. Although the ship interiors we see during Tali's loyalty mission convey this sense much better, with the incorporation of plant life on the main live ship to imply the intentional overgrowing of the hydroponic systems, and how as much space as possible is used for storage. Moving to the other factions' spaceship designs, Humanities go for the design process of building the entire ship around a single main cannon, with the most obvious game comparison being the designs of most human ships in Halo, yet with a more compact frame and most of the differences being small enough that it could be easily missed at first glance or viewing each ship in isolation, unlike the different categories of Halo ships. I can't speak for anyone else, but it took me ages to see the differences between the System Alliance Cruiser and the Systems Alliance Dreadnought. The main exception to this being both versions of the Normandy, which share visual similarities to human and Taurian capital ships as a visual reference to its origins. With the Normandy's other design species, Taurian ships incorporate a lot of angular designs, along with focusing more on giving their ships a wider field of fire. Although one thing that I feel isn't really that well conveyed is that the Normandy bridge design was incorporated from Taurian ships, which isn't seen when you actually see the bridge part of actual Taurian ships, unlike with the interior bridge design of Alliance ships in Mass Effect 3. Although there are descriptions for how their ships operate, Solarian ships have never been depicted in the games, aside from a single image used in the galaxy map locations. At least for confirmed appearances. The ship-type things in the background of some of the Citadel cutscenes could be the Solarian contribution to the Citadel's defence fleet, or they could be the fuel stations from the second and third games aimed at a distance. An interesting detail about Geth ships that I didn't actively notice for several playthroughs was their visual similarities to the Reapers, while still being a distinct design. Although likely done with the out-of-universe intention of making Sovereign blend in with the Geth until the main reveal of Mass Effect 1, similar to the difference and similarities between something like the irregular and superstar destroyers of the Galactic Empire, instead of just taking the original model and rescaling it. It also fits with the in-universe fact that the Geth heretics in the first game were veered into the Reapers, and seemingly the Geth as a whole all had awareness of their existence prior to the events of the game, with this potentially being the origin of Geth ship designs in general. Also, it makes the
Ah yes, Reapers
cutscene from Mass Effect 2 make seemingly more and less sense, as the visual similarities would easily lead to confirmation bias regarding whether or not Sovereign was a Geth ship among the Citadel leaders, while also making it seem like the possibility of Geth having more than one ship of that scale was never considered by the other species. However, the Geth fleet, aside from the starfighters, seems to mainly be the same model, all with its scale altered to make the standard ship, dropships, and dreadnought from Mass Effect 3. On the topic of Geth starfighters, I'm also surprised that they were shown to need regular Geth piloting them, based on the way the Geth had been referencing as operating, instead of having more Geth programs upload into them, similar to how the armatures operate in Mass Effect 1 and 2. Mass Effect 2's collector ship is a mix of organic and traditional building methods, a much more obvious version of how the game's final set of levels revealed the Reapers operated. Although we don't see anything specific for or against this point, I also doubt that Prothean ships have had much, if anything, in common with collector ones. Mainly because there were text-based references to finding ancient Prothean ships, and if the modern species noticed that Prothean and collector ships were almost identical, then a faction in the universe would have likely made the connection between them much sooner, and much like with the contrast between the designs of the Prothean beacon and the mass relays and Citadel, the playable areas of the collector ship and collector base levels don't match up with what little we see of the Prothean designs in the game. In particular, with their cities looking similar aesthetically to Prothean beacons in a form of brutalist architecture. And in general, their artefacts look as if they follow the normal divide between technology and nature as the other species, with the state of Ilos being a case of the site being overtaken by nature as an expected result of 50,000 years worth of time passing and isolation, with the Eden Prime flashbacks likely being equivalent to what some of the areas would have looked like in a clean and well-kept condition. Whereas, like the squad mates can comment on, the collector ship and base have a much more insect-based aesthetic, which looks nothing like the two main Prothean sites that the player can see throughout the games. So, are there any small details like this that you feel deserve a mention? Or alternatively, anything in this video inspired you to look for throughout your next playthrough? Drop it in the comments. Also, if you're interested in other very niche topics that almost no one has thought about in this fan base, feel free to check out my last video of whether the EU Reapers had intended to invade midway through Mass Effect 2. Thanks for watching.